Okay, so I'm just going to open up the mic here for a second. We have 5 or 6 people viewing. The link is on my page. The link's also in the YouTube side chat. We're just hoping to get some people in here to either represent the mythicist position or people that are unsure or agnostic on the issue. And we can discuss historical evidences for and against the proposition that a historical Jesus existed. And we can talk about what type of historical baseline we're trying to shoot for. Obviously, the historical Jesus is going to be different from the theological Jesus, and I can tell you what distinctions we can make from that. We're going to, as all historical discussions on the issue, we're not going to presuppose any theological or biblical inerrancy or anything like that. We're just trying to approach these ancient texts as honest, unbiased historians do, and by applying historical critical methodology and just seeing where that takes us. So if any of you have the link and are not willing to participate, maybe you could just circulate the link by sharing it on your page or offer it to someone you think might be able to contribute to the discussion. Okay, I don't want to start out by presenting evidences because I've already have a video where I laid out a good portion of evidences, even though there's more stuff I could bring up. I was just hoping to maybe get some people in here and start a dialectic, but I guess I could go over some kind of just formal stuff on the historical method. What kind of methodologies do historians use when evaluating ancient text for historical content? So first things first, let's talk about the historical criterion of multiple attestation. The historical criterion of multiple attestation is a general rule of thumb that states that the more well attested and independently attested, i.e. the sources of attestation do not derive from each other. So the more independently attested a historical event is, the more likely it is to be true. Okay. Now there's certain types of attestation that are preferred over others. For example, early attestation is preferred, all things being equal, over later attestation. Not to say that something attested later is necessarily false. It's just stating that the type of testimony and attestation that historians would prefer, all things being equal, would be attestation that happens early in relation to the events. So that's one criterion that they'll talk about is early independent attestation. We'd also like to see attestation come from the same or general geographic location. So for example, and that's also just a general rule of thumb. It doesn't mean far, widespread, and reaching geographical attestations from far, far away can be false. All things being equal, they're just less likely to be so, generally speaking. So, for example, if we have an event that took place within a Native American tribe in the 1400s in North America, and we had 3 sources. One source was 50 years later from close geographic proximity to maybe 200 or 300 miles. Then we had another source whose was also, or another source that was, say, a certain time period further than that, but it was comes from a geographic location from like India or from somewhere over in the Far East. Then all things being equal, the source that's more likely to be the case would be the one that's closer in time and closer in geographical proximity. All things being equal, it doesn't mean that a source coming out of India writing on an event that took place in the 1400s in North America can't be true. It just means if we were to look at all things in history and which things are accepted as being true historically, we'll notice that a pattern develops, and said pattern develops that most of the things that are accepted accurately historically not only happen fairly early, or derive their sources from earlier material, but they also derive themselves from fairly close geographically. That doesn't mean that it's impossible for something written 1,000 years later in another location to be false. It's just not as likely on the bell curve, as we would say. So that would be the criterion of multiple independent early attestation. There's another criterion that's called the criterion for embarrassment. It's a really crucial criterion. It's used a lot in biblical studies. Basically says this: people who are making up or completely forging a historical event are less likely to include something embarrassing to the movement or to the founder or to the people involved. Because if none of it is in keeping with history and it's all made up, it's more unlikely that they would include something made up that's embarrassing, right? So most of the time when we find embarrassing criterion in historical texts, it's not because, or it's more likely the case that this is actually some certain historical event that just happened that is embarrassing, and they left it in keeping with historical truth, rather than it being made up and they just added it to discredit or debunk or make their movement look silly. So that's another general rule of thumb that and I can actually show you how this applies to the historical Jesus case. So most scholars agree that historical Jesus existed due to the preponderance of historical evidence, but they think that there's very few things we can know with a high degree of certainty about Jesus's life. For example, the most unanimous or the most agreed upon thing in the historical census is that Jesus Christ was crucified in or around Jerusalem in around the years of 30 to 33 AD. Okay, and so let's talk about why the crucifixion would meet the historical criterion of embarrassment. Okay, so we're going to have two different scenarios here. Scenario one would be that Christ never existed. He's completely made up. And the other one would be that Christ did exist and he was crucified. So if Christ, let's take the first position. If Christ was a complete myth, completely made up, he never existed, and the people that wrote about him were merely trying to convince people of his movement and so on and so forth, and everything they wrote upon because he didn't exist had no keeping of historical accuracy with his life, i.e. because he never existed, then what most historians think is that whoever wrote about Jesus would be far less likely to include the embarrassing criterion that he was crucified as a heretic and a criminal. Most people think that if they were going to make up a historical Jesus and he wasn't crucified as a criminal or a heretic, and he just died an average death like anyone else, or never existed at all, that they wouldn't include something so embarrassing about the very movement that they're trying to put forward. So that is called the criterion of embarrassment. It's just more likely that Jesus actually was crucified as a criminal and a heretic in and around Jerusalem between years of 30 and 33 AD, rather than it's not more likely that it was completely made up and the people just included some fact that was untrue, that was highly, highly embarrassing about the very movement that they're seeking to prove. So that would be second historical criterion of embarrassment in its application. Now, there's a few more. For example, another criterion is called enemy attestation. This is a very interesting criterion. It's used quite often in Greco-Roman history and literature. For example, enemy attestation goes something like this. If a source is attested historically by an enemy source, i.e., a source that is not on good terms with the movement or the people or the group it's historically purporting on, then that's more likely to be true, because the enemy attestation is highly more likely to be suspicious and ultimately critical of the movement and things in and around it, right? So if even the enemies attest that Jesus existed, then it's more likely that he existed, because they would be the first ones to be, if he didn't exist, to be highly critical, highly skeptical of that. If you see an enemy attestation that presupposes said event, that generally meets the criterion of an enemy attestation, that it's more likely, given the fact of the enemies not wanting to, or being highly critical, would not take the position that Jesus existed if in fact he did not exist. It's another general rule of thumb. There's no exact measures to any of these criteria. They're just on the bell curve. They're more likely to be the case than not. Now, this isn't a historical criterion, but this is often something that is of interest to most secularists, and does fall under a certain rank of enemy attestation, or extra outside of the movement that's being attested. This would be like extra biblical sources. So most people will say that this would fall under independent attestation, that it's better if there are other independent sources not from the movement that also testify to the same things. So any extra biblical, i.e. any non-canonical source, or any non-Christian source, to better clarify, that purports on a historical Jesus, is more likely to be true, simply given the fact that they would reflect less bias and be independently attested, and be more willing to be critical, or at least not as endearing as the movement itself. So that would be the detailing of the historical methodological criterion of multiple attestation, criterion of enemy attestation, criterion of embarrassment, and extra independent sources not from the same movement. In this case, they'd be considered extra biblical sources. So with all of that being said, I could go into the specific lines of evidences, but for the purpose of this hangout, I was hoping that we could get a little bit of dialogue and dialectic going instead of just a raw presentation, because I already have one of those presentations currently on my channel. So I'm going to take a few moments and see if anyone's willing to come in. If not, I may or may not decide to start presenting some of those evidences. Okay, so someone in the audience is asking me to talk about the oral tradition, that the validity and accuracy of the oral tradition that was passed on before the Gospels were written down. This is a little bit off subject, but it does tie in, and I think I can detail that for you guys. So most of the historical critical scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was either written shortly before or shortly after 70 AD. Most of the people seem to think that it is slightly after the fall of the Second Temple, so which would put it a little bit past 70 AD. So with that being said, if Jesus died in, let's just take a round number, 30 AD, that's actually pretty commonly accepted, that Jesus died in 30 AD. So if the Gospel of Mark is written in the year 70, then we have 40 years going past in this specific amount of time. So I'm just going to address the earliest Gospel, which would be Mark. So we have Jesus dying in 30 AD. We have Mark's Gospel being written right around 70 AD, 40 years in between this. Okay, so let's talk about the sources that scholars there's a certain field in biblical studies, and it's called it's called source criticism. What it tries to find out are what sources do certain biblical authors use. For example, most people think that because of basically it's a how should I say this? Basically, there is a certain understanding within source criticism in biblical studies called the synoptic problem, which details the relationship between the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and basically say that because of the high degree of similarity and word for word taking out of most of these gospels, that they derive from each other. With that being said, we can tell that most likely, due to Markan priority, which means Mark was the first gospel, and there's reasons to believe that's the case. And I can detail that in a second. Because of Markan priority, and because of the commonly held view in source criticism called the two-source hypothesis, that they think that Matthew and Luke both used Mark. Not only did they use Mark, they most likely used the hypothetical sayings document, or logia, called Quell, or Q for short. Quell is the word for source in German. So with that being said, we know that Matthew and Luke most likely use Mark and Q, and that's the leading theory. And but what about Mark? So when it comes to Mark, most people think that Mark probably developed from an oral tradition, or possibly what's called a pre-Markan passion narrative, that because the passion takes a very, very rigid and formal structure, that they think that, and it appears has a high semblance of accuracy with the Johannine Gospel, or the Gospel of John, that they think there's most likely a pre-Markan passion narrative that was circulating around. So Mark didn't use the Q document because there's not very many sayings of Jesus contained in Mark. So let's assume that an oral tradition needs to transcend about 40 years time. Okay, so with that being said, most people realize in early biblical studies that these people that were the earliest followers of Christianity were Jews themselves. In fact, the Jewish-Christian divide didn't happen until about 85 AD. That means that the Christians and Jews were actually praying in the same synagogues up until about 85 AD, where they had a council called the Council of Jamnia, and the final fracture of the Christian and Jewish churches basically took place. Part of the Council of Jamnia got professing Jews to disavow that anyone could be the Son of God, and most Christians at that point stopped attending synagogue because they weren't willing to do that. So with that being said, we know that the earliest Christians were from the Jewish tradition and were still observant Jews. You can actually tell this from the book of Acts. The book of Acts actually has up in the upper room before Jesus appeared on Pentecost that they were actually observing Jewish tradition. So they were still doing this. So why do I bring that up? Because it's very interesting that one of the strongest of all cultures in oral tradition is the Hebrew culture. Hebrew culture has very, very accurately transmitted oral tradition throughout history for long, long periods of time, much, much longer than the 40 years that we're speaking of now. So if we were to talk about oral tradition and its validity and subsequent accuracy, I think via the fact that we're appealing to a very, very strong community and culture that appealed to oral tradition in almost everything that they did, that would be a good reason to believe that the 40 years in passage between Jesus's death and Mark would have a high degree of accuracy. So that would be one reason to believe that the oral tradition passed between was very, very good. Another thing is, let's presuppose something else, that in fact it wasn't necessarily done from oral tradition, that there were written sources that Mark used. This is usually called special M, or this would be material special to Mark. So a lot of people assume that whatever Mark used, he did use some sources. They're probably just lost throughout history. It probably wasn't all derived orally. And what would be the arguments to assume that this is the case? Well, one of the arguments to assume this is the case is because Jewish people of the time had a very, very high level of literacy, especially the Jews from the inner cities. Now, Jews in rural settings didn't have a very high degree of literacy, but they had a much higher degree of literacy comparatively to other cultures. So with that being said, having the Jewish culture having a strong oral tradition, a very high degree of literacy, and the fact that Mark probably did use sources, special M, that were special to Mark, basically implies that regardless if the oral tradition or the written sources are true, or a combination of both, we have good reasons to believe the validity and accuracy of such as manifested from the Hebrew culture. Let me give you one more line of evidence that backs up how well the Hebrews were at transmitting written documents. So what we know is that the bulk of the text that we have for the Old Testament actually is called the Masoretic text. Okay, the Masoretic text derives from about the 5th century A.D. from a Hebrew people called the Masoretes. And the Masoretes, they invented vowel pointing in a much more concise and clear way to write the New Testament. And they're actually responsible for the vast majority of the text of the Old Testament that we have today. With that being said, there was an archaeological find that most people are familiar with called the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls was found in a community along the Dead Sea called Qumran. The Qumran community is where we found a very, very, very large percentage of ancient Hebrew biblical text. These ancient Hebrew biblical texts that were found in the Qumran or Dead Sea find actually were not Masoretic in origin. These were pre-Masoretic texts. Okay, so and what that means is when they began comparing the Masoretic text from the 5th century AD to the Dead Sea Scrolls text, which were thought to have been buried around 68 AD or before that, then what we notice is that there's about a 500 or 400 year gap between these two things. And what we notice is upon textual comparison, there are very, very high degree of accuracy. More so than the Christian text. When you take a Christian text that's evolved 5 centuries, you'll notice that the Christians actually made much more mistakes. And the reason because of this is because, first of all, the Christians were a new religious movement that was starting out. They were writing for speed and transmission rather than perfection. They were trying to use it as a highly to spread the word to evangelize people. When Hebrews were a very sealed off, hermetic culture that wasn't really intended on evangelizing people. But due to the decrees of Jesus, the fact that he's offered or told his disciples to go out and evangelize, spread the word, make disciples of all people and all nations, the Christians were more apt to copy quickly and spread the text as fast as possible, rather than the Hebrews, which were only producing the text for themselves. They were less apt to produce them quickly and more likely to take a lot more time and go over them as slow and as meticulously as possible. So some of the ways that they did this are just obvious. These are common ways that are employed today in proofreading text. So you'd have your scribe, he'd write the text, and then you'd have another scribe and come back and proof check it against another text, the base text, okay, which would be called an archetype. So they would take the base text or the archetype, and they'd have another scribe come in and check it, and then he would make corrections from the archetype where there were spelling errors or any type of grammar or synaptical problems or omissions or so forth, and along those lines. So, and they would do that proofreading a couple of times. Now, this would take a lot longer to produce a single text, but as I said, they weren't looking for speed. They were more interested in accuracy. So if you guys want to look at that, just look at a good thing to Google would be a comparison of the Masoretic text with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can show that. I think one copy that was found, it was a copy of maybe 7 or 8 books of the Old Testament, had 2% variation. Only 2% of the text varied over 4 some centuries, which is, if you were to look, for example, if you were to look in Greco-Roman literature, it's much higher. We're talking 15 to 17% variation, which is just shows you how serious they took this. I mean, they were handling biblical text. But I'm going to give you one more example to back this up. The Hebrew people, anytime they wrote the name of God on a piece of paper, that paper could not be destroyed. They would always hold on to that piece of paper. To destroy it was thought to be heretical. Basically, they just, any text with the name of God on it, on the Hebrew culture, was a religious text, and they would do all that they could to preserve it. So that would be another line of evidence. If anyone else has any questions from the side chat, I'll answer those. But that's a fairly detailed accounting of why we ought to believe the oral tradition and subsequent literary tradition that traversed the 40 years between the death of Jesus and the Gospel of Mark. So I guess I will go ahead and start presenting some evidence. There are a few people watching, and I do think that although I have presented this material on multiple occasions, it might be helpful to some new people that are listening. So until we get some participants, I will go ahead and start making a positive case. So the first thing I want to appeal to is to the actual biblical texts themselves. The reason why is because these are the earliest text we have about Jesus, and they're written in close geographical proximity to the events. And so with that being said, we'll go ahead and throw down one of the criterion of multiple independent early attestation. So first of all, let's talk about, all things being equal, why historical documents are preferred to be earlier rather than later. And then we'll do an analysis on how early the biblical texts are in comparison to like Greco-Roman literature. Okay, so we've already talked about how early Mark is dated. Mark's dated by critical scholars right around 70 AD. This is about 40 years after the death of Jesus. So this is super early. This is earlier than 95%, or at least 90% of ancient history as recorded. It doesn't take place within 40 years. The Gospel of John is thought to be the latest gospel. It's thought to be written anywhere from 90 to 100. Some people may take a little bit after, but generally the consensus view is that it was probably written in 90 to 95. Now I'll go ahead and shore up some of the historical reasons for why we ought believe Mark to be written in 70, and why we ought believe John to be written in 90 to 95, probably pre-100. So let's start backwards. Let's start with John. Okay, so we've already told you earlier about in 85 there was a Council of Jamnia that finally fractured and created a division between the Jews and the Christians using the same synagogue. Well, if you open up John's Gospel, he actually, when referring to the word synagogues, he always uses the word their synagogues. He doesn't say our synagogues. He doesn't say the synagogues. He says their synagogues. So most people believe that that reflects a post-Jamnian tradition, meaning that John's obviously saying their synagogues because this was written after that final fracture of Council of Jamnia, which took place in 85 AD. So what is another reason to believe why we ought date John in the 90s? Well, I'll give you an actual physical line of evidence. The earliest fragment we have of any New Testament text is a tiny credit card scrap of the Gospel of John. This is called P52. P stands for papyrus. So, and this was the 52nd papyrus that was ever found. Okay, it's currently located in John Ryland's library, okay, in England. So with that being said, P52 is dated through paleography. This is handwriting. Handwriting would change over time, not just the handwriting, but how they would actually write the letters themselves. And upon paleography analysis, most paleographers, they had 4 experts evaluate the Gospel of John through paleography, and the 3 of them dated it around 130, and because of an apostrophe that appears that was left out in later, they did away with that after a certain amount of time. And one of the paleographers, very well respected paleographer, dated it to 90. So they just averaged out. Most people think, you can even look this up, P52, John Ryland's papyrus. This is usually dated to about 125 AD. Well, let's say 130 at the latest. Let's just take the latest that the paleographers think it was written. So with that being said, that gospel, we have an intact portion of the Gospel of John from 130, and due to certain things internally within the text, it must have been dated pre-130 if it was able to spread, and surely most people don't believe that was an original. With that being said, and given the certain types of information there, we also know that some of the early church fathers quoted pieces of John as early as 120 to 125. Some people think Ignatius maybe even quoted them around 115. With that being said, we can even back it up a little further. Most of the higher critical scholars think it's somewhere around 90 to 95. Another reason why they think it's around 90 to 95 is because of a high semblance between the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of John. John has very high Christology. The Gospel of Thomas has a very high Gnostic Christology. And they believe that the interplay between the Gospel of John and Thomas shows that these texts were written around the same time. Now, the early camp for Thomas dates it around anywhere from 50 to 60, contemporary with the Gospels, and the late camp dates it no later than about 130 AD, 120 AD. That being said, the arguments for the early camp easily help to put John very early. For example, one of the arguments from the early camp is that John was actually, the writer of John was criticizing the early Gnostic community and their views about a non-physical Jesus by actually taking the leader of their tradition, Thomas, or who they hailed as a leader of their tradition, and having him actually touch the physical body of Jesus after he resurrected. He puts the fingers in the wounds, my Lord and my God. And blessed are those who have seen and not believed. That being said, they think that high degree of interplay is actually means that Gospel of John and Thomas were contemporaneous, and they were used as polemical material against the other. With all of those arguments being said, that's the arguments for why the Gospel of John should be dated to 90, 95, and why. So let's talk about Mark. Why do people date Mark to around 70? Well, there's a few reasons for this. First of all, one of the reasons is because when Mark talks about the fall of the second temple, the falling of the temple, that all of these stones will come crumbling down, that in fact does reflect something that happened in history. The menorah on the top of the synagogue was actually made out of pure gold, and when they put the synagogue on fire, a lot of the gold melted down in between the rocks. And they tore every rock down to get to the gold in between, and not necessarily to get to the gold in between, but also to create a symbolic, hey, you mess with Rome, we destroy everything that you have. So what they think is that the Gospel of Mark was written shortly after these events, when he would have had knowledge that that's what happened to the temple. Now, another reason is because Mark is thought to have been written in and around Rome, right after or during the time of the persecution of Christians under Nero. The reason because of this is because, well, let's talk about the reasons for why it's thought to be written in and around Rome for a Roman audience. When Mark uses any Hebrew traditions or traditions, he always translates what they mean and for what purpose. Like, for example, the washing of the dishes and so on and so forth. He gives explanation. Matthew, thought to have been written for a Hebrew audience, Jewish audience, never ever goes into these explanations. But Mark seems because the argument is that Mark's audience is probably unfamiliar with these things. That's why he goes into detail to explain. The argument is that Matthew's audience was thought to be familiar with these things. There was no need for him to go into that detail. So now, with that being said, there's also a lot of Latinisms that appear within Mark that don't appear in other Gospels. For example, the word centurion. The word centurion appears in Mark but does not appear in Luke and Matthew. It actually is another variation, a Greek variation, not a Latin variation. So it's not centurion, it's something else. Let me pull it up. I actually have some notes on this I can give you. I can be a little bit more precise. One second. Okay, so here we go. Let me find it. Okay, I'll just start reading off a lot of these. Okay, here it is, centurion. So it's spelled kenturion or centurio, and both Matthew and Luke use aketratronekes, which is a slightly different variation from the Greek, okay? So it's not the Latinism, centurion, it's the Greek variation, aketratronekes. So with that being said, there's many, many Latinisms that are found in Mark. Would you like, so some of them would be, when he says, Jesus asked them, what is your name? To a demon, he says, my name is Legion, for we are many, right? And this is a Latinism for a legion of men. My name is Legion, for me, we are many, implying that we, the demons, are many. Another one is when Jesus said, he answered and said unto them, give them something to eat. And they say unto him, shall we go out and buy 200 pennyworth of bread and give them something to eat? Well, the word there, 200 pennyworth, is 200 denarii, which is a Latinism. And it goes on and on and on. And there's many, many of these Latinisms contained within Mark that are not contained in any of the other Gospels, or at least not in that frequency. So most people think, because of that, it was either written in or around Rome for a heavy Roman audience. Now, let's talk about some of the persecutions. We know that Nero started persecuting Christians very heavily after the burning of Rome. The burning of Rome took place in 64 AD. Nero died in about 68 AD by committing suicide, or at least being assassinated. There's a bit of controversy as to that, and they think that because of Mark's uses of heavy references to persecution, that he's in fact addressing a Roman audience that's being heavily persecuted during or just after the time of Nero. So some of the references would be Mark 4:17. He said, this is on one of his parables. He said, but since they have no root, they only last a short time. He's talking about the certain seeds that were scattered on different soils. And so he's saying basically here that the ones who don't have a firm belief, they only last a short time and they can't last through the persecution. Another one is Mark 13:9. It says, but be on your guard, for they will deliver you to the courts, and they will deliver you to be flogged in the synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake as testimony to them. So in Mark 13:9, you can look these up for yourself. Mark is actually saying you will be persecuted. Here's another one, Mark 10, verses 29 and 30. Jesus says, truly I say to you, there is no one who has left houses or brothers or sisters or mothers or father or children or farms for my sake and for the gospel's sake, but that he will receive 100 times as much as now in the present age, houses and brothers and mothers and children and farms, along with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. Another one is the very end of Mark. This happens in Mark 16:8. This is actually the last verse in the short ending of Mark. It says this. He says, the angel at the empty tomb commands the woman to go and tell, but in Mark 16:8, it says, they said nothing to no one because they were afraid. So what they think this ending is a challenge to the persecuted church. Will you obey and preach the word of Jesus, or will you not tell anyone and be afraid? Okay, so those are the heavy references of persecution, and good reasons to believe why Mark was written right around 70 AD, and those are the reasons why John was written right around 90 AD. Now, with that being said, how does this early, so we know that the sources that we have were written anywhere from 40 years to 60 years after Jesus' death. Matthew and Luke are going to fall somewhere in between. So Mark 70, Matthew and Luke between 80 and 90, and John 90 to 100. So how does this stack up with Greco-Roman Tradition, well, exceedingly well. 90% of all ancient and classical history does not appear that early. For example, let me pull up this document that I have where I've actually go over all of the sources. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I can actually show you guys what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is a screen share. This is a hand-compiled document from a textual critical source called Tertullian.org that details ancient manuscripts and how early the manuscripts that we actually have in hand are, and I did a bunch of comparative writing. So let's look at these are all going to be contemporary writers. These people are writing right around the same time as the Gospels were being written. This would be Josephus and Antiquities of the Jews. This would be Tacitus and the Annals. Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93 to 94, published in Rome in 20 books. Tacitus's Annals were thought to be written around 116 AD. The parallel lives of Plutarch thought to be written anywhere from about 75 to 100, depending on which parallel life you're appealing to. One of the most famous is the parallel life of Caesar. Suetonius, writing around 121 AD, writing the 12 Caesars, the Vita Caesarium. So let's start from the top. So here we are. Let's look at Josephus, the Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93 to 94 AD. Okay, so he's writing this around 93 or 94 AD, but when did these events take place? Well, the events in the Antiquities of the Jews take place anywhere from Genesis all the way to 100 AD. Okay, and they're the best source of material that we have from anywhere from the year 200 BC up into the year 100 AD. So most Greco-Roman scholars are taking Josephus' renditions here of this part of history as very, very highly credible, and they're very, very highly detailed accounts. And he's writing on events anywhere from contemporary to 300 years prior to what he's writing on. So he's actually writing on events that happened before he was alive. Okay, he's right. Besides Philo of Alexandria, who's a Hellenistic Jew writing in Alexandria around the 1st century BC, Josephus is our best source for early Hebrew history. So, as you can see, the date written is 93 to 94 AD. Now, what is the earliest manuscript that we have? Okay, what you'll notice is the earliest manuscript that we have is Codex Vaticanus Palatinus, and this is from the 9th or 10th century. But what it is only a very small fragment. It only contains the Antiquities, chapters 11 through 17, and it also contains the life of Josephus. When we actually get down to complete work, the earliest complete work that we have is the 15th century. This is Codex Vaticanus. So what it shows you is, for this specific work, that's on a very highly authoritative work for all of Hebrew cultures, from anywhere from the years 200 BC to 100 AD. It was written anywhere from contemporaneous to 200 to 300 years of the events it writes on. The earliest manuscript that we have is 900 years later, and the earliest whole copy that we have is 1400 years later. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and do a slight comparison with the Gospels. Okay, Gospels, dates written 70 to 95 AD. Okay, and these were written not contemporaneous or 300 years away from the events. They were written anywhere from 40 to 60 years away from the events. That's much, much earlier than Josephus. And what is the earliest manuscript that we have? This is just a fragment for this one. This isn't the whole copy. This is just what is the earliest manuscript we have in hand, no matter how small. This one, as we've said, only contains 6 of the books. Earliest manuscript that we have for Christianity is the one I cited earlier. It's P52, Papyrus 52, the Rylands Library Papyrus, which is thought to have been dated around 120 to 130 AD, with the Gospel of John thought to be written around 90 AD. That is 40 years away. That is unheard of. This is 900 years away for what we have in Christianity. 40 years away. Boom, that's huge. And you'll notice that as we go down, it's the same for everyone. Earliest manuscript for the Annals of Tacitus, 930 years later. The earliest manuscript we have for the parallel lives of Caesar is 10th century. So that's over 900 years later as well. Earliest copy we have for the 12 Caesars is also in the 9th century. So that's 700 to 800 years later. Okay, now let's talk about the earliest whole copy. Okay, the earliest whole copies that we have of the New Testament is contained in they're called the Great Uncial manuscripts, and these would be Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus. And these two manuscripts arise in the 4th century, which means we have whole copies of the New Testament that from 300 years after the events. Okay, well, what about everyone else in Greco-Roman history? This one right here is 15th century. So ours arises, earliest whole copy for Christianity arises 300 years later, earliest whole copy for Josephus 1400 years later. Okay, what about some of these and these are famous historians. These aren't just I'm not scraping the bottom of the barrel on Greco-Roman history. These are very, very famous, highly regarded historians for Greco-Roman history. What about for Tacitus's Annals? 11th century, okay, second Medician manuscript. It's 930 years later. It's the exact same manuscript. The only manuscripts we have are complete copies that derive from the same manuscript. I can give you a little bit of the information on that. It says all of the late Italian manuscripts, some 31 at last count, are copied from a single medieval manuscript. Also in the Laurentian Library, where is number 68.2. It is referred to as M2, or Second Medician, to distinguish it from the unique codex of the Annals 1 through 6. Bound with it are the major works of Apuleius, written slightly later than Tacitus, but at the same time. This manuscript is written in a difficult Benevisian hand. It was written at Monte Cassino, perhaps during the abbacy of Richter, which is around 1038 to 55 AD. It derives from an ancestor written in rustic capitals, and it contains errors of transcription natural to that book hand. So what that means is that all of the manuscripts that we have can be traced back in a root lineage of cladistics all the way back to a single manuscript. And this one appears some 930 years later. Okay, what about for Plutarch? Earliest complete copy, 13th century. That's going to be 1100 years later. So ours is 300 years and theirs is 1100 years later. What about Suetonius? 9th century, he'd write in the year 121. So that's some 700 years later. So if you look, we have got our manuscript tradition is not only earlier, it is much better well attested, and the earliest fragments and whole copies we have are much, much earlier than any Greco-Roman tradition. Now, this doesn't mean that they're true. What this means is that all things being equal, this is the type of attestation historians prefer. So now I'm going to close this out, and I'm going to say a couple more things. It is a known fact that is undisputable that the Christian New Testament is the largest, most well-attested work of antiquity. Would you like to know number 2? Antiquity is any work written between pre-BC to the years 200 AD. The second most well-attested work from that period is the Iliad. The Iliad has 638 copies. That's huge. That is absolutely commendable. That is massive. Okay, most don't even have that at all. Most have about 40 or 50 for that example. So the Iliad having 638 copies is very, very huge. How many do we have for the Christian New Testament? Okay, in the earliest languages, this would be Greek, Latin, and Syriac, and Peshitta. We have over 15,000 copies. Over 15,000. It is the largest, most well-attested work of antiquity. If you think I'm lying to you or being biased, I dare you to Google it for yourself. So now that we've seen that and we've gone through all of that information, let's start connecting the dots. Okay, so we have the gospel traditions that report that Jesus was a historical person. Okay, and we have them unanimously stating that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are all written extremely early, and we have well attested. We have very, very early fragments and whole copies of these manuscripts. They're written in the right time period and close geographic proximity. So let's talk about the geographic proximity for a second. Mark's thought to be written in Rome and or around Rome. The Roman Church was founded in apostolic succession by the Apostle Paul and people that he sent out. And other early apostles. In the letter to the Romans is written in 55 AD. You can check the dates on these. These are not evangelical dates. These are higher critical scholarly dates. So the Roman church was already established in the 50s and probably pre-50s. So we're talking some 20 years after the death of Jesus, we've already got a church up in Rome set up by the actual apostolic fathers. That's huge. And that's drawing from a tradition that's very, very close. Now, it might not be too close geographically, but it derives from a line of a succession of people that were in those geographic locations. So let's talk about the Gospel of Matthew. Gospel of Matthew is thought to be written in or around Jerusalem, around 85 AD or slightly later. Some people think it could be written as far as Antioch, Syria, but no farther. The reason because of that is because it seems to be appealing heavily to a Jewish audience. The Gospel of Luke, it's hard to really pin down. There's been many different proposed places. It's a complex argument. I don't want to really go into that. The Gospel of John was thought to be written in Ephesus in Asia Minor. It's decent ways away geographically. But the letter to the Ephesians was written in the late 50s or early 60s and also derives the same apostolic succession that we're talking about for Rome. So it might be a little farther away in geographic proximity, but it's deriving from a line of people that were close to that geographic proximity. So with all of those things being said, we can now start connecting the dots on why the Gospels are multiply independently attested. So we have the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Okay, if you're familiar with the synoptic problem and source criticism in biblical studies, you'll know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are derivative of one another. Most people think, due to a theory called Markan priority, that Matthew and Luke are derivative of Mark and not the other way around. The reason because of this is fairly simple. We know that there's a high literary relationship because literally Matthew and Luke use word for words, paragraph for paragraph from Mark. Now, one reason that we think that there's a high why Mark was first is for a few reasons. Mark is the shortest gospel. Mark is 661 verses. Luke being around 1100 something, and Matthew being in the low thousands. So what you'll notice is there's 40% more material in Matthew and Luke. Now, what happens when people use sources? They usually add stuff to those sources, and it usually becomes larger when you use a source, not get smaller. Another reason is because Mark actually used some of the most primitive language in Greek. And when people use a source, they often clean up language that doesn't sound so good or the syntax is a little off. They don't dumb it down. Most people clean it up. So what we've noticed is that Matthew in particular and Luke have cleaned up, in their usages of Mark, have cleaned up the syntax, cleaned up the vocabulary. So it usually goes that works that are used as sources usually clean them up rather than dumb them down. So those are some of the quick arguments for Markan priority. But given Markan priority, and basically it says that the three synoptics derive from a same tradition. So these wouldn't be multiply independently attested. These would just be one single attestation, namely the synoptic attestation. But what about John? John hasn't used these as sources. Now, John may have heard of the tradition, but this is no different than any other historian hearing of any other tradition. As long as he didn't use it as a source and it doesn't derive an actual literary relationship amongst the text, they're considered to be independent. So we have first piece of evidence, the dual independent and early attestation of the synoptic and the Johannine tradition. Stating that Jesus was a historical person. So those would be all of the arguments from A to B to Z, all the way down, and the reasons why. And I'll go ahead and give you some more lines of evidences. We already talked about the criterion of embarrassment. We'll go over that one more time in reference to the crucifixion, and we'll also talk about the baptism by John the Baptist. So I'm going to pull up the wiki because I think there's an interesting quote here that can help enumerate my point for me. Give me 1 second. It says this is on the Wikipedia page for the historical Jesus, and it's in the second paragraph. It says this: the vast majority of scholars who write on the subject accept that Jesus existed, citation 5, 6, 7, 8. Although scholars differ about beliefs and teachings of Jesus, as well as the accuracy of the accounts of his life, the only two events subject to almost universal assent are that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist and was crucified by the order of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Okay, so let's talk about this. That's interesting. Why do the majority of scholars who are in the best position to evaluate the evidence because of their credentials, why do they think that the almost two events that we can actually say for certain that happened in Jesus' life were that he was baptized by John the Baptist and crucified by Pontius Pilate? Well, mainly because these two pieces of evidence, they're multiply attested in extra biblical sources, namely, well, the baptism isn't. John the Baptist himself is attested, but the crucifixion is attested in Josephus, the Testimonium Flavium, chapters 18, books 18, chapter 3. With that being said, let's talk about how this meets the criterion of embarrassment. So I told you earlier that if these people, there was no historical Jesus and they lied about it and they made this guy up and fabricated it from nowhere, it's less likely that they would fabricate this guy being crucified as a heretic and a criminal. Well, I mean, they could have made up anything. He just ascended to heaven one day in the lights and glory. Why make him crucified as a heretic and a criminal? You know, he could have given his life, you know, in another way if need be. It didn't have to be so embarrassing to the movement of Christianity that he died as a criminal and a heretic. So most people believe that, look, if these people were going to make these things up and Jesus never existed, they surely wouldn't have included anything that wasn't true, that was that embarrassing and detrimental to the movement, namely that the founder was a criminal and a heretic. No. The reason why they included it is because those things are probably most likely did happen, and they included them to be in keeping with historical accuracy. So let's talk about John the Baptist and how this ties into the criterion for embarrassment. John the Baptist was known to have been baptizing for the remission of sins. This is even attested in Josephus. I think it's in book 20 on the passage on John the Baptist. I can actually pull up exactly what passage it is. Give me 1 second. I will give you an exact passage reference for you guys. Okay, the passage is going to be Josephus on John the Baptist. It was not book 20, it's book 18, chapter 5, paragraph 2. So it goes like this. Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God and that they were justly as punished for what he did against John, that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him, he was a good man. Herod, who feared lest the great influence of John had over the people might put it in a power and inclination to raise an rebellion, accordingly it was sent as a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle before mentioned, and there was put to death. So it talks about John that was called the Baptist. Okay, now John was thought in the Gospels to baptize for the remission of sins. Well, in Christian theology, Jesus was sinless. What is the significance of that? Jesus being baptized for the remission of sins by John the Baptist is an embarrassing detail. Most Christians would not have wanted to put this in there unless it was in fact true. Why have? Because it creates a theological problem. The problem, namely, being is that Jesus is thought theologically and doctrinally to be sinless, and now we have him being baptized for the remission of sins by John the Baptist. So those are why those two events are almost universally assented by all people that write in the subject, because they're multiply attested in various sources, i.e. Josephus, the different gospel traditions, the synoptic and Johannine tradition. And not only that, they meet that multiple independent early attestation criterion, they also meet the criterion of embarrassment. So that's why. So that's another line of evidence. Let me go ahead and keep it going. So let's talk about the extra biblical sources. Let me go ahead and grab my book here so I can pull out the Talmudic references. So what we know is that there's many extra biblical references of the movement of Christianity itself and a few to Jesus. Now the most used of these references are going to be Josephus and Tacitus, and another would be the early Talmudic references. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the Josephus reference and some of the material. This is a highly contested reference, and most people that contest it or talk about interpolation don't know jack shit about the subject. So, and that would include Floyd F.P. He knows the one-liner surface material that it's considered to be interpolation, but if you ask him why and the arguments for and against, he couldn't tell you. You have to go back to his shelf and grab Richard Carrier's book and start thumbing through the pages. Now, me, on the other hand, I can actually tell you the arguments without doing so. So, I'm going to go ahead and read off to you the passage that we have on, it's called the Testimonium Flavium. Actually, I'm going to start from a different way here. Let's not bring up the Testimonium, because in fact, Jesus appears twice in Josephus's work. One in the Testimonium Flavium, which is the Testimonium of Flavius, i.e. the testimony of Josephus. It's just what it's been called. It was never given that name by Josephus himself. It's just what it's referred to in the scholarly circles, the Testimonium Flavium, i.e. the testimony of Flavius. Flavius being the first name of Josephus. His real name would be Flavius Josephus ben Matthias. His dad, the son of Matthias. So the reference that I'm talking about James, the brother of Jesus, actually appears in book 20, chapters 9. Okay, and it's a long quote, and I'm just going to cut out the relevant parts. It would take over a minute to read the whole thing, but you can definitely check it out. It's in Antiquities of the Jews, book 20, chapter 9. So I'm going to start close to in the middle where I have it in bold text here. Let me go ahead and share my screen for some clarification here. This could probably help you guys. Okay, so here we are. So as you can see, this is Josephus's quotes on James, John, and Jesus, and here's the Josephus reference to James, the brother of Jesus. Here's the reference to John the Baptist, and here's the famous Testimonium Flavium, all of which are two references of Jesus and one to John the Baptist contained in Josephus's works, the Antiquities of the Jews, which we already went over the manuscript tradition for that earlier. The Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93 to 94 AD in Rome, published in Rome in a 20-book set. So let's go and look at the reference to James, the brother of Jesus, who offhandedly mentions Jesus is not considered to be an interpolation by almost any of the scholars. Now, the Testimonium Flavium is considered to be an interpolation by some scholars, but interpolation does not equal forgery, and we can talk about the distinction between said set. So, as you can see, here's the larger paragraph, and here's the main stuff. It says, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when they had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Now, what's interesting about this is, in early church tradition, they hold to the same thing. James was stoned to death by a Sanhedrin council in and around Jerusalem, and he was one of the founders of the early Jerusalem church. You can find this in Paul's early letter to the Galatians, written around 52 or 53, Galatians chapter 1 and chapter 2, where he went and met with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. You can look for that in Galatians chapters 1 and chapters 2. We can pull that up in a moment if you guys would like. Now, so it seems to meet a lot of things that are commonly understood about Jesus. He was called the Christ. His name was Jesus. He had a brother named James, and he was stoned by a Sanhedrin council, whom the Sanhedrin operated in and around Jerusalem. Boom, 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 boom. That meets like 4 historical criterion right there. It lines up rather nicely. So this one is an offhanded mention. It doesn't go into a lot of detail. If it was thought to be a Christian interpolation, most people think that the Christians would have added a whole lot more here, as they think that was added to the Testimonium. But as you can see, it just says very, very simply, he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, not who was the Christ, who was called the Christ, whose name was James. So most people don't think that this reference is interpolated. And I can actually prove this. It would be Josephus on Jesus wiki, Josephus on Jesus. Okay. Here it is. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you guys. Okay, here we go. going to share screen. I thought I had this up already. I apologize for that. Josephus on Jesus. Let me see if I can find James, the brother of Jesus. Let me find. Okay, a number of variations exist between the statements of Josephus regarding the deaths of James and John the Baptist of the New Testament's accounts. Scholars generally view these variations as indications that the Josephus passage are not interpolations, for a Christian interpolator would have made them correspond to the New Testament accounts. So what it actually says here is that most scholars believe that the James, the brother of Jesus reference is not an interpolation. So that's something interesting to note there. The highly contested one is not John the Baptist, the Testimonium Flavium reference. So there we go. We have a reference of a James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and all of these things seem to meet up with things that we know about history, namely that the early church tradition said he was stoned, said that he was killed by the Sanhedrin in and around Jerusalem, said that his brother was named Jesus, one who was called the Christ. Now, we can go on to the Testimonium Flavium. So this is the Testimonium in its full context here. It says, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accepted the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Christ, and went upon the accusation of the principal men among us. Pilate had condemned him to a cross. Those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Okay, give me a second. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So that is the reference there, and most people do contest this as interpolated. Let me see if I can give you guys. Actually, I probably should keep sharing my screen to help facilitate this discussion. Let me see. Okay, so if you can see, I put in bold what are the areas I'm in question. These are what appear to be interpolated, okay? It says, if indeed one ought to call him a man. It seems like Josephus, who's a non-believing, he's not a Christian, he's a Jew, he doesn't believe. It seems odd that he would write this. If indeed one ought to call him a man. Then here he says implicitly, he was the Christ, okay? Now that's kind of odd, okay? So a lot of people for a lot of time have thought that thought conjecturally that this was an interpolation based on those two aspects, and probably the unlikelihood that Josephus would write in such a manner. Okay, with that being said, what is the very first indication that we have that it was an interpolation? Okay, there's a guy named Origen. He's one of the early church fathers. He's writing in the year about 130 AD, and he actually quotes, paraphrases Josephus, and actually gets mad that Josephus did not think Jesus was the Christ. So here it is. This is Origen and Contra Celsum, which is Latin for against Celsus. Celsus was an early critic of Christianity who did not believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And Origen is writing an apologetic work in this regard against him. So it says right here, now this writer, talking about Celsus, although not believing in Jesus as the Christ, attributed the fall of Jerusalem to them putting to death James, the brother of Jesus, because he was a just man. That's just a paraphrase of what's later on going down here. So, whoa, this is interesting. Origen is getting pissed that Josephus didn't reference him as the Christ, but all of the copies that we have actually have Josephus saying he was the Christ. That's the very first reason why most people think it's interpolated. Why? Because Origen, writing very, very early, probably had hands on a non-interpolated version. And then he goes on in another work called Commentary on Matthew, also seems to write the same thing. That Flavius Josephus, who wrote the Antiquities of the Jews in 20 books, when wishing to exhibit the cause of why people suffered so great misfortunes that even the temple was razed to the ground, said that these things happened in accordance with the wrath of God in consequence for the things they had did against James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. Okay, so and the wonderful thing is that though they did not accept Jesus as the Christ, he yet gave testimony to the righteousness of James. So again, he says Jesus, who was called the Christ, yet Josephus did not hold to this. He did not accept that Jesus was the Christ. So here's two spots where Origen, a very, very early writer, writing some 20 to 30 years after Josephus's work was published, is sitting here saying dead on that Josephus never called him the Christ. Okay, so that's the first suspect of why there's probably interpolation. Okay, so what do the scholars say? Okay, there's a famous scholar by the name of Paul Winters. He wrote a very famous essay in 1954 on what's known as conjectural interpolation. That is, the interpolation doesn't arise from any manuscript evidence physically of the source. We don't have any differing manuscripts that we can judge interpolation by, but it's strongly conjectured as so based on certain evidences. Let me see. I'm getting a Hangout call. You decline that. All right. So, with that being said, where was I? Okay. So with that being said, Paul Winters said that he highly suspects that these three bold printed things are interpolations, and he says merely taking these out would probably best reflect conjecturally what we would think the non-interpolated core to be. Okay, pretty well put together essay. His name is Paul Winters. He wrote it in 1954. You can check that out online if you would like. I actually have a copy on my computer I can distribute to you guys on my Google Drive. With that being said, so we're going to fast forward a little bit to 1971. Not an archaeologist, but a linguistic Hebrew, Latin, Arabic linguistic scholar by the name, Jewish man, or non-observant Jew, but he was Hebrew in origin, by the name of Shlomo Pines, actually finds an Arabic and Syriac manuscript and a Slavic manuscript, and dating from the 10th century, that contain a non-interpolated version, and it appears to reflect what Paul Winters thought. So here's the 10th century Arabic manuscript. It's found in a guy called Agapius of Hierapolis. Agapius Hierapolis was a Christian writing, I can't think of it, the 3rd or 4th century, but the manuscript itself is in the 10th century. So here is the verse. What happens? Paul Winters was right. It doesn't have "if indeed one called him a man." That isn't there. And it doesn't say he was the Christ. It says he appeared to be the Christ, okay? And it also doesn't have this reference right here, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, which seems to be a Christian interpolation saying that the Jews condemned him. So the early Arabic manuscript that was distributed by another textual line also holds to the same thing, namely that Paul Winters seems to be correct in that there was an uninterpolated core of Josephus that authenticates a historical Jesus. Okay. With that being said, I'm not going to sit here and present a whole lot of information because I think no one's probably going to come in here, but I'll wait a little while longer, and I'll probably just end the video. that being said, I don't think anyone's going to join. I don't really expect Floyd or anyone like that who hasn't really put in their due diligence on said subject ever step foot in a room with me this well prepared. So with that being said, now that we've lost most of our viewers, I'm just going to end it there, and I'll edit this later, and we'll put it as a presentation for what it is. Thank you for listening.